Buongiorno a tutti, di nuovo sono Elisa Bruno.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Elisa Bruno. I am a lawyer specializing in juvenile offenders. I'm very happy to give you to talk about my experience. And I would also like to thank the previous speakers for having actually spurred so many thoughts about this topic. First of all, I would like to apologize in case my presentation or what I'm going to say is not really fully matched by my slides. Can you see my? No?
Ok, altrimenti possiamo inviarla noi, eh? Sì, sì, certo. Per venire dalla regia.
No, we can see it now. Yes. I think we...
La vediamo. No, adesso non più. Aspetta. No, non si vede.
Aspetti, riproviamo. È probabile che ho sbagliato qualcosa io. Condivido.
C'è, la vediamo.
Yes, we can see it.
Benissimo. Non mi soffermerò
Okay,
molto
I won't
sulle definizioni
deal with the various definitions concerning trafficking in human beings, because this has already been mentioned by the previous speaker, by Alessia Cassia. What I would like to focus on is a preliminary definition that we have from the Council of Europe Convention on Action, THB, the Warsaw Convention 2005.
Sì, ok, adesso?
Perfetto,
ok, va, benissimo. Vi chiedo scusa, mi sentite bene? Sì.
Can you hear me? Yes, we can.
La Convenzione di Varsavia.
So the Warsaw Convention in practice is the first real definition, provides the first organic definition of trafficking in human beings. It defines all those elements already mentioned by Alessia, highlighting the risk for exploitation, the transport, inclusion, transfer of a vulnerable subject to another country across a border by using coercion, abduction, in case of children, also even without these coercive systems. Let's see here, just it's a sort of refresh. So we have the action. This is the coercion of the recruitment, use of coercion, and these are the aims of exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices of similar to slavery, servitude, etc., or removal of organs. Before getting to the analysis of the individual entities in our legal system, I think we need to look at Article 11 of Directive 36 by the European Union, which requires member states to take all the necessary measures to establish appropriate mechanism aimed at the early identification or assistance and support for victims in cooperation with relevant support entities. This multidisciplinary approach is not just a practice required based on common sense, but it's required by the regulations that we have just mentioned, and failure to apply it is an infringement of the law. Who are the actors in this multidisciplinary approach? who are the members of this great team to help children? First of all, NGOs, public authorities, immigration authorities, legal guardians, social workers, police, prosecutors and judges, and guardians, legal guardians, and health workers. On this very model, so to implement what Europe is asking us to implement in Catania back in 2016, as already mentioned by Alessia, after huge migration flows in those years, a multidisciplinary team was established of experts, including different professionals, that was named Catania City Counting Trafficking. This was established with the prosecutor's office in charge of trafficking crimes, and the juvenile court participated as well, police, non-governmental organizations, and the anti-trafficking authority, which has jurisdiction in our region, legal guardians, and the IOM. Now, all this aims at not only meeting applicable requirements, but in particular at protecting the victim, who has to be protected from all points of view. As already mentioned, under applicable regulations, 3 objectives must be identified in order to fight trafficking, in particular, repression, protection, and prevention. Based on data, on investigations on data, we realized that no single action can be implemented without all the other actions also being implemented. So, protection of victim and subsequent emergence of risk of exploitation can be achieved only by, at the same time, implementing all the 3 pillars. We have seen that timely identification is essential, because in this way it prevents any re-trafficking, abuse of traffickers, sexual abuse, complications caused by unwanted pregnancies, complications of other social complications. What are the indicators of possible trafficking of human beings? For sure, a difficult family situation, normally economic difficulties, age, lack of education, lack of information as to the journey they have taken, and also lack of information as to how to get to Europe. Europe is for these girls is a sort of dream to be achieved. I'm saying all this because this has an important impact on new forms of victim recruitment, abduction, forced marriage, other dependency on exploiters. A debt bondage, a debt was undertaken in order to leave for these girls. All these words and also false information received by these girls. What's the basic assistance that has to be guaranteed once a victim or potential victim is identified? For sure, a safe shelter. So reception, a fully safe place and shelter, urgent medical treatment, counseling and information as to the possibilities that the victim has for her life. Also, accurate translation and interpretation is important. And on this very point, unfortunately, I have to mention here that due to the lack of proper interpreting and translation, there is actually a confusion between cultural mediator and interpreter. These are two completely different professionals. So the interpreter just has to translate, to interpret what has been said to the victim's language, whereas the cultural mediator works in a different way. That is to say, also tries to interpret and to be a bridge between different cultures. These activities are very important, just like any legal advice and assistance is also so important. Now, as we were saying earlier, when answering the question that had been raised, when there is a potential risk or any doubt that the victim might be a child, might be underaged, so the victim shall be presumed, shall be deemed to be a child and shall be accorded special protection measures pending verification of their age. That's Article 10 of the COE Convention, Council of Europe Convention. Now, what is the most important thing that we need to do? What's the first action we need to take if we have established that the victim is a child? So as soon as an accompanied child is identified, we need to appoint a guardian. There are different protection strategies for children in Italy, in particular with reference to the protection of unaccompanied children. So appointing a guardian ensures that the child is granted all the rights, as mentioned earlier, all the rights required by the Convention on the Right of the Children, the CRC. We have seen that over the last 6 to 7 years, there have been several amendments or several changes in Italian legislation. In particular, a so-called Zampa law was enforced with a particular attention to unaccompanied foreign children, with particular reference to some more vulnerable conditions, for example, sexual exploitation, etc. I would like to tell you that as far as the children court in Catania, even before the enforcement of the Zampa law, that is to say, in which the guardian is a requirement, in our court in Catania, we were already providing all the necessary protection and assistance to children based on the provisions by Law 194, 1983. In other words, the Children Court in Catania would apply the principle of equality to all children in Italy. And the court would identify as vulnerable children who were unaccompanied without parents. So they could been deemed to be in a condition of abandonment, so that they were left on their own. And this would ensure them all the necessary protection, a pro bono lawyer, for example, a guardian, and listening to the child, right to health care, and also to legal proceedings to be held and led by juvenile magistrates of the juvenile court. In this way, the child was actually protected from all types of risks. Then there is Article 18 of Legislative Decree 286, dated 1998. Elisa already mentioned the importance of emergence of trafficking practice. We can see here that already back in 1998, human trafficking is a very old crime. And I would say that that particular legislation was a very practical and also very detailed piece of legislation. All necessary resources and all necessary social policies were to be provided by taking a victim-centered approach and providing a comprehensive protection to victims. And the same applies to international protection. I'm not going into detail on this, but we all know that in particular trafficking, human trafficking, has been recognized also by NHCL guidelines, but also by practice and by court decisions, that trafficking is one of the elements on which political asylum can be granted. In particular, as to assistance to child victims within the Italian legislation, this assistance has to, first of all, ensure the best interest of the child in all actions and decisions. This can be achieved only by appointing a trained legal guardian, a properly trained legal guardian, and can only be reached through the respect of individual needs, and also in compliance with all the procedures required to assess the age of the child. As to well-trained legal guardians, I would like to point out two things. Zampa law actually has provided for voluntary legal guardians legal guardians who have to be close to where the child is. And actually, this is something new compared to what was done in the previous regulations. For example, previous regulations would refer to the appointment, let's say, of a mayor or people who are not close enough to the actual child involved in the case. So this is very important assistance provided to the child, and and so this is so important that cannot be. I mean, the role of a guardian is so important that cannot be carried out by volunteers. Actually, I have the privilege of having developed and grown myself with children I was working with in the past. Again, guardians, as I said before, were only on a voluntary basis. So being a child guardian was seen as a sort of a charity action. But this has nothing to do with what are European regulations. According to European legislation, a child is an individual who is the holder of rights. And in order to guarantee them, these rights cannot be protected by a volunteer, let's say. So we need to have trained legal guardians. This is a basic requirement because the guardian has the responsibility to understand that the guardian's work has an important impact on the future of the child. So any voluntary work may actually jeopardize the future of a child. Now, let's see what are the various protection forms in the various criminal proceedings.
Punisce con pene molto alte il fenomeno della tratta. In questi tipi di procedimenti,
in these types of proceedings, it is fundamental, once again, the super specialization, competencies, coordination with the various actors who protect the child victim. And this is ensured during the investigation phase. Our experience is on the field, thanks to a constant and immediate work of relationship with the prosecutor's office. So the victim subject to threats was analyzed, and it was possible to follow the action to avoid the threat, sorry, and to develop a proceeding for the perpetrators. Child victims and generally speaking vulnerable subjects, in order to avoid various hearings with various actors, and this would be a risk of a secondary victimization concerning the past, the experiences and the trauma. So there is the evidentiary element. And so the child, the victim, witnesses in front of the judge, and it is a form of hearing that anticipates the debate and concludes the procedure of exposure of the victim to the proceedings. And so it is possible to acquire an evidence also for the debate, for the discussion. and for the final decision. And this allows to take some special measures of guarantee, for example, the use of a double screen room. The victim do not see the trafficker, the perpetrator of the crime. And the use of a filter, that is the preliminary inquiry judgment, who will filter the questions to be asked. And these questions, the victim will not have direct questions, and the possibility of recording, of observing the elements relevant to the psychological and the physical condition of the victim. These can be important indicators concerning the type, the existence of the crime. Once the trial has been launched, after the inquiry phase, the victim has the possibility of being civil party for civil damages, that can be applied to the perpetrators of the crime. Concerning this point, it is fundamental to ensure a connection between the guardian, the juvenile court, and the specialized defender, who can ensure the presence of the child within the trial. From a point of view of feelings, because I was damaged, so I have the right to participate, to listen, to contest, and to know what happens to what made me a slave in material terms, because this complaint can be already advanced within the criminal proceedings. I'm now referring to a clause, a specific clause with a double value, the no punishment of victims of THB, as indicated by the Article 26 of the COE Convention. What does it require? In case of victims of trafficking, in case of crimes committed by them correlated to their condition of exploitation, so the existence of these crimes cannot be punished. And so the Italian system has not transposed yet in a direct manner this standard. But we can use the concept of a situation of necessity, of need, identified in the fact that victims were forced to commit those crimes because they were victims of coercion and of exploitation. I must say that there is a point of jurisprudence that is concerned. There are the crimes, the fact that the crimes might be correlated to false declarations, to false information about themselves and names and so on. But the element of the behavior cannot be excluded. It is true that the crime has been committed and the victim has given false information on himself or herself, but we have to stress, and we hope that the jurisprudence, the case law will develop this principle, that is to say that the elements linked to the motivations of that action by the victim cannot be represent a fault concerning the type of crime because it was committed because the victim was forced due to the condition of exploitation. There is another important principle. The forms of protection, of assistance to the victim are not conditional on the victim's cooperation with the authorities, the judicial authorities. The protection must be guaranteed. Let me remind you what Lina Trovato, the director of this table, magistrate of Catania, said. The protection of the victim concerning the repression action can never be correlated or strictly anchored to the declarations of the victim. We cannot think that we have to protect a person who is vulnerable and fragile if we anchor the whole procedure to the declarations. We must use some resources, especially during the inquiry phase, that can allow us to reach immediate and efficient results. But first of all, we have to protect the victims against possible retaliations linked to the credibility itself too. So I'm sorry, Elisa.
We are already with the time over, so if you may wrap up, would be perfect. Grazie. Si è potuto avviarci verso le conclusioni. Grazie mille.
I have finished. Thank you. Sorry. Concerning the irrelevance of consent in case of children, we have already talked about it. So I have come to my conclusions, and I think the reflection has already been mentioned in the questions. So if you want to go faster, go by yourself, or otherwise, if you want to go far, you go with others. So when can we consider the path of risk of exploitation concluded, and how does child justice system affects prevention and child victim protection? The last consideration, I always remember the sentence of one of the girls I was guardian for. So she was called a victim, and she said, I don't want to be a victim anymore. I want to be free. This path is concluded when the autonomy is ensured, and so the protection of the vulnerable person must be ensured also through a courageous investment in terms of social and policies in order to avoid that the victim can be involved in other exploitation forms. Thank you.